Okay. I think we're good to go. So if it's okay with everyone, I think it's, we've had quite a lot of my voice, and there's some questions here we can start off with on the chat. So there's Hannah. I can ask Ad's question because he's obviously left. But Hannah and Vincent, if you'd like to, so we'll start off with Hannah. Are you okay to unmute and maybe just introduce yourself, Hannah, and then just ask the question, then we can hear from someone else as well.
I'll scroll back to it so I don't do that academic thing of talking round the question before actually asking it. There we go. Yeah. So I'm looking at nudge and behavioural insights in social housing. And I'm well aware that positive language can mask some controlling interventions. And I know one person I've interviewed was looking at digital technology and tenant behaviours in the properties. So far the presentation's been sort of very optimistic in the languages used in how tenant engagement can occur. But I'm just wondering, you know, what are the actual details of engaging with tenant behaviours in their properties? Because really what I think is being talked about is changing habits of how people interact with these new sustainable homes. And that can feed into problematic discourses around the incapable tenant, the needy tenant who is in need of reform. So I just wanted to flag that, really. So I think, you know, there's that saying, isn't it, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So flag that there is this risk, I guess, of, as David put it quite succinctly, of control versus engagement, and also wondered where that sat as well, because we've been talking about community housing, but there's also the larger scale landlords who will be trying to pick up development programs, and the potential role of digital technologies, because the person I interviewed was talking about using digital technologies to bypass the conversation was with tenants to monitor their behaviours in the home. So I just think there's a lot to unpack around that.
Shall I give a little bit of an answer to that? I mean, I think you're right in terms of having those concerns, Hannah. As somebody that on a separate project has developed something we call the Big Sister House, I can understand exactly where you're coming from. That was a house with a number of technologies that were put in order to provide people with support, but also an environmentally friendly off-grid housing environment in which to live in. And yes, there were means in which the landlord could intervene directly into that house and monitor the person's behaviour in that house, should they so wish. So I can see where you're coming from that. I've also sat through many presentations where people have talked about wonderful environmental schemes and said this would have been fantastic if the tenant had just worked with us and followed the technology that we've got. And we particularly have that as an experience as an association, because trying to be an innovator around all issues green, we were an early starter on the air source heat pumps agenda. And we discovered that air source heat pumps didn't work for people's lifestyles in the UK in the affordable housing sector, and that was because they had an interrupted energy supply. Because for those of you not from the UK, we have a rather barbaric way of being able to cut off people's gas and electricity if they're not up to date with their bill, and then they have to nip down the shop and spend some money at a far more expensive rate than people that can afford to pay their bills to then get themselves switched on. And of course, air source heat pumps rely on a standard level of energy going into it, otherwise it's the same as a direct heating system and extremely expensive to heat their properties. And the fault for air source heat pumps not working was ascribed as a tenant's fault rather than us not providing an environmentally friendly technology that worked within the tenants. So our experience from that has been that we have to produce technologies that work in the background of a tenant's home, where the tenants can be comfortable with them and make them work, rather than trying to change a tenant's lifestyle to fit the technologies that we want to fit in a property. And that's been very much a fundamental principle of how we've developed our working mechanisms around that. And actually, we go a step further in terms of that with the cooperative method by engaging residents in the environmental measures that we're trying to introduce. So we have done a number of environmental schemes in Redditch Cooperative Homes. We've produced the old Code for Sustainable Homes, Code Level 6 houses on several occasions. We pioneered the timber frame system that Accord has now opened a factory up to produce low carbon housing generally across its stock. But there are a series of technologies that we've never used, despite me trying to get them introduced into our properties because they were unacceptable to our residents and revolved around a lifestyle change. I suppose the most obvious one of those that always gets a laugh is the concept of compostable toilets. It's not something that is acceptable to our residents, and so it's not something that we've tried to do because it would require a behaviour change that our tenants aren't prepared to make. And whilst the compost toilets is quite clear an example of that, I think there are other technologies around that line, such as air source heat pumps, that require a similar change that for some reason we think is acceptable to impose on people when we don't use that technology ourselves in our own homes, and then blame the tenants when they don't work. And I don't think that's an acceptable process. And I think the way to avoid making that mistake about how we develop low carbon and circular housing solutions going forward is to make sure that the people that are going to be living in the houses are making the decisions about the technologies that go in there. And I suppose that's our approach, and that's why David was able to put an upbeat commentary on it. But I think the issues that you identified are very, very real, and I think we either need to have a change in energy policy, or we need a change in energy policy which either changes the way energy is supplied to people that are struggling to make ends meet in the UK, or we need to have a change in the way we supply heat to those properties, because the current system is going to force people into cold houses that they can't afford to heat, and then we'll be blaming them for them not being heated. So that's how I would answer that question at the moment.
No, that's really helpful, because I know when I was interviewing the person who was using these particular technologies, that it was very much about, oh, well, we've engaged with the tenants, but this process of trying to change their minds with these quite invasive technologies. So there's also that language around what tenant engagement actually means, and also what you mentioned about the reason why air source pump heating didn't work. There's another interpretation from behavioural economics, which is the psychology of poverty, which I've just been pulling a webinar together on. So even when you are looking at behaviours, I think it can flip really easily into quite a negative interpretation or a positive one, because the psychology of poverty would have started from the standpoint of the person who has interrupted money flows and been like, well, that's just not going to work. And that's from the same theoretical ground as nudge theory and behavioural insights as it's enacted in England by BIT and in the Netherlands by BIN-NL. So it's whenever you've got these rooms for these interpretation, a slight shift in angle can cause a massive difference. I'll send you a direct message as well about talking about that further if you like, because I'm still in the data collection phase of my research.
Yeah, certainly.
Thank you.
I think Bill wanted to say something.
Yeah, if I could, Bill Hartlett, Chair of Redditch Co-op Homes, long-time friend of Carl, travelling the globe. Yeah, we're very, very democratic. I would say that, wouldn't I? I'm used to be leader of the council. We set up the co-op, but it really is tenant engagement. Like, we select the tenants 6, 9 months, sometimes 12 months before the scheme is completed, and they are involved. I say Carl brings all the things to them. They say, no, that won't work. That won't work. We took them to Norway, which has never happened. You take tenants to where you're going to build the houses and source the material, and they anglicised what the product was going to be bought, and it is real tenant engagement and real tenant in control, because the council have 100% nomination rights. They didn't know what a co-op was in some instances. They just wanted to be housed. And Carl does, as he said, sell them what he thinks is the best and the greenest and the best product. But I know we don't want to be called those type of people that live up the hill. They want to be part of the community. So it is, you could call it a compromise, but Carl gets about 90% of what he wants, which is a pretty good hit rate. But it is real tenant engagement, and they talk to each other. There's a circularity between the various co-ops within Redditch. It's only a small borough of 74,000 people, and we've got 6 co-ops and 700 houses. So it's a small town, and they all meet on a regular basis, either at the board or virtually, or at the checkout at Tesco's. So it really is a good model if you want to come to Redditch and see it.
Yeah, that would be great.
Thanks, Paul. Hannah, I think also with your question, I think what's going to be interesting for me in terms of the research is that question around allocation, because that sort of feeds into your sort of questions around how intrusive is it, the kind of buy-in, acceptance from tenants. So even though sort of Carl said they go according to housing need and it's sort of council waiting lists, they also have that kind of lead in time, and that's sort of 6 months to a year engagement with the tenant. So it's sort of, they're not sort of pre-selected, sort of special tenants, or if you like, sort of chosen because of their wanting to be involved in the sustainable project, but there is that kind of level of engagement sort of before the tenancy starts. But from my understanding, I don't think there is anyone from Woonbedrijf, Sultan, but from my understanding with Woonbedrijf is they're looking specifically at tenants who have sort of a buy-in into the kind of concept of the sustainable housing, and they're happy to be part of this kind of collaborative feeding back over the first 2 years on their experience of living in the property. So it's kind of it's more kind of.
6 of them volunteered to get involved in the process.
So to volunteer to get involved and live in the properties, exactly, isn't it? So that's
my understanding as well. I hope Marika was here.
Yeah, so that was my understanding too. Yeah. So in terms of the kind of control and that kind of, from an empowerment point of view, it's those tenants choosing to become involved in the project, and then but this is what's going to be really interesting in terms of sort of comparing and contrasting the different approaches and
definitely.
To what extent is tenants sort of from bottom up, or sort of stuff imposed on tenants, and that comes back to the argument of is it just normal social housing, and is it just about sustainable dwellings, and it should be kind of business as usual, and tenants shouldn't really feel the difference. There shouldn't be any inconvenience. They should be in a comfortable, safe home that's affordable, and there's no other kind of intrusion. Or is it about, is that not appropriate in terms of like proper tenant engagement? I think that will be really interesting to unpack.
The timing factor of allocation has also come up in my interviews with behavioural focused interventions. So I think there's a lot to unpack there, and one concern I have about UK, the Netherlands has more of that cooperative overleg and polder model, whatever culture. So I think there may be potential more to engage people on more of that let's have a conversation basis. Even though it looks like they're going the same way of England with residualised housing stock, we are in such a situation in the UK where it's going to be, do you want this house? Yes. I think is going to be more of an answer. But I think there's a lot that I'm with my social housing matters head on. I am still also interested in that point of allocation around the current problem we've got in social housing, where landlords think it's acceptable to let completely empty homes. So I think from this sustainability new builds, there's also potential for things to feed back into the rest of the sector, looking at more environmentally friendly ways of letting properties that are more acceptable to tenants. Personally, I think it's ethically problematic to rent empty boxes to people, but also in environmentally sustainable ways. So I'm interested in that little bit of learning round there as well on feeding. Are the things that are going to unpack that can change current sector practices, sort of blowing back into previous practices as well as the thinking that we're doing.
Absolutely. No, that's really useful. Thanks, Hannah. I guess we'll sort of watch the spaces again and see how it kind of unpacks, but those are really key questions to be posing. I think it's Vincent. Did you have a question that you wanted to ask David, or rhetorical or otherwise?
I think I just made the point about the difference between tenant resident engagement and resident social capital, also triggered by your own presentation. And I think, of course, in many cases, resident engagement is crucial also for creating a circular economy in housing. But I wonder if really building their social capital is naturally a core element. And then I'm thinking of, increasing their opportunities on the employment market, increasing their education, increasing their network, etc.
So is one more important, one more essential than the other
Well,
one?
is social capital, building social capital, as I described it, a natural element of a circular economy in housing?
I think I'd like to answer that in terms of the research and the research evaluation project, because I think in Halima's kind of review of the literature, she was kind of trying to identify gaps that the work in this stream might fill. And it seems to me that the exploring the social impact from the point of view of various forms of resident engagement, and she included Einstein's ladder. So we might think about very low levels of consultation up to organising the housing provision in such a way that it builds social capital as well. I wasn't trying to be prescriptive, I suppose I was actually, because I think Redditch Cooperative Homes is a good organisation, and I'd like to see more social housing organisations like it. But from the point of view of the CHARM work stream, I think the key point is to contextualise the organisational environment in which these projects are taking place, to look at both the scale and ways in which residents are engaged or not engaged, whether it's something done to them or something that they have are able to play a key part in. And in order to understand that, I think we do need to understand more about the case study organisations. And that's why you might have felt that the description of Redditch Cooperative Homes was a bit boring in terms of detail. But I think actually getting those details right and seeing how this case study might differ from other case studies and in what ways will be important in terms of drawing conclusions about the social impact of the circular economy. So that's really the reason for arguing it that way.
Yeah, thank you, David. Just to be sure, I think that resident engagement, giving them a certain amount of control over their housing is crucial in many cases, also in regular social housing, even if it's not circular. And I do think that if you include stuff like increasing social capital, so really like personal empowerment, empowerment of their competences and skills, etc., of the people themselves, is a bit more of a natural friend in the cooperative housing, like in the RCH case you described. But in normal social rental housing, I wonder if building that social capital is, from a circular economy perspective, a natural element. And then I do agree that in the project, of course, it's really good to look at the resident engagement and how it's played out. And when I look at your question, I think that in many cases you need resident engagement, but we also worked on a circular kitchen. And then one of the options was, we didn't choose it, but one of the options was to building it in such a way that the resident wouldn't even know the difference. So it would be much more easy to maintain and refurbish for the landlord, but the resident wouldn't even notice the difference, which would, of course, would have been very acceptable to the residents because they got the similar product. So in theory, in some cases, it is actually possible to not have real resident engagement.
Yeah, I think it's very useful to problematize these issues. I'm wondering when you describe the non-cooperative housing as being more normal, I wonder whether the circular economy project could play a part in creating a new normal, which is of more participative housing. Do you think the tendency is towards less participation or more participation?
No. I think it is natural that you engage tenants, and I think also implementing a circular economy would give more opportunities even to engage tenants. It's a bit academical. From the concept of circular economy and going back to Halima's presentation, in which you see that in many cases that real empowerment of people is not a natural part yet of how we think about circular economy. I think that's in a way logical from the concept itself. It might not be where we want to be. We want to be completely sustainable, people, planet, profit. But from the circular economy concept, it is actually focused relatively on planet and profit. That's
right. That's exactly what all the literature is saying. Although it is arguing that that perhaps there should be that. If there's a correlation between the circular economy and triple bottom line and CSR and those kind of sort of more market orientated concepts, there should be some sort of social capital output. So, but again, it's a combination of the literature is looking at and saying two things. One, it's saying that it's an intrinsic part of the concept of circular economy as we understand it in a very it's a very embryonic kind of stage. So there's that one aspect, and it's more that the literature, that the kind of research hasn't focused on enough, and it's a taken for granted. It's a taken for granted key part of circular economy. So that social capital, social aspect, people part of the triple bottom line should be there. It's just not focused enough in terms of projects and research, as opposed to saying, is it a core part? There's just like a slight distinction, I think.
Yeah, it's pretty academic.
Yeah, it's academic, exactly.
Maybe we can go to the pre-academic discussion part.
Yeah, you know, fair enough. It's kind of almost semantics, but I think that's interesting to unpack. But coming back to David's point again, does the Charm project have a particular direction it wants to go in? What are each of these organizations trying to achieve, whether it's sort of explicitly or implicitly through the work, the way they work with tenants and communities anyway. So it's interesting. I can't scroll, for some reason I can't scroll back through the chat, but I know Ad had a question before he left that he sort of brought up. I don't know if Sultan, can you pick it up, or David, does anyone see the question Ad posed? It's somewhere near the top, and for some reason mine is sort of stuck on just the lower questions.
Odd questions like, is plastic free, also in the RCH project? Is that really on the top of the mind of the community, of the people?
Paul, maybe, David, I don't know who might respond to that.
There's one for Bill. Is Bill still with us?
Bill?
So in terms of why plastics in Redditch, where do the concept of plastics come from?
So
your microphone's off, Bill. Hang on a second.
There we go.
Okay, am I on now?
You're on now.
Yeah. Why plastics? Well, I think we're a testing ground. We were the first eco housing in Redditch, the first wooden houses in Redditch. So I think Accord see Redditch as a good place to develop because we've got such a good relationship with the local authority, and that is key. I mean, I'm a councillor on the local authority. I've been there for 30 odd years. We set the thing up, and it seemed to be acceptable in Redditch because it's the council, the planning authority, the chief exec. Everyone knows everybody, and it's seen as a good thing to do. 100% nomination rights, so it sort of works, and there's no resistance to trying new things out, like the eco housing, the wooden housing, the Code 6, and now plastic free. The chemical toilets, compost toilets were a step too far. I joke, but it's, you know, some areas they're resisted. I mean, Carl and I have spoken across the UK to various councils, and there's always a resist. I don't know what the resistance is. Maybe it's local authorities not wanting to give the power up and to give the power to the tenants. But in Redditch, we're happy for tenants to take control and tenants to be involved. It's more efficient. They get a better deal. There's less voids. There's less rent arrears and greater tenant satisfaction. So the next step about plastic free is just a natural progression. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I mean, I think what Bill says there at the end is the critical thing. There's been an evolution in Redditch, which started by involving residents in their housing, which involved them forming a series of cooperatives. Those residents then said, well, my fuel bills are higher than I expected. So we then started to look with them how we could reduce their fuel bills, which got us to look at eco-housing. That eco-housing evolved into closed panel timber frame housing, which evolved into a factory. And so it's been a journey that we've been on with Redditch, with the cooperatives that we work with in Redditch, and with Accord Housing Association, which has then led us to seeing if we can take plastic out of the product that Accord have developed around low carbon housing.
I think Carl will tell you, all the conferences we go to and tenants come along to, the biggest advocates are the tenants themselves. They sell it to the other tenants. I mean, they said at an early stage, housing's always been done to us. We're a local authority housing or a housing association tenant, and we're told what colour door we're going to get. We're told when we're going to get the house painted. We're told when we're going to get the repairs done. Whereas in the co-op, there's an element of control and trust, and they love it. They really like it. And they're the ones that, with no trouble filling our properties, because there's a waiting list, not because of need, but because they know they're going to be involved in making decisions, and they're going to be involved in having a better future in their housing world. And it builds their confidence. As we said, they've gone on from being unemployed to being employed. We just release their potential. That's all we do. We give them confidence to say, well, what do you think? Now, what would you do? And they're not used to being asked those questions, and they go on to get more confidence, and they go in employment, become school governors, and get better jobs and become better citizens, I think.
That's great. Thanks, Bill. Any more questions to kind of open up the discussion a bit further? Any other questions to the presenters or the project partners at all?
Well, I would have a question about the second question on the slide. How equipped are the organizations to engage residents, and particularly in creating a circular housing environment? Mm-hmm. Because, of course, many social landlords have a lot of experience in resident engagement as such. Mm-hmm. This is also quite new for the social landlords themselves. So how to engage residents when you don't really know what you're looking for, maybe perhaps, and what are the best solutions yourselves. So I don't know if there are people from, of course, calls there, but maybe other as well from social landlords. How do you deal with that in the resident engagement process?
Is there anyone?
Nudge someone to reply. I don't know if it's empowering. I can answer if you want, Vincent, and maybe Joris can come in afterwards, or possibly Isabel. I think my answer to the question would be that when we don't know what we're doing is probably the best time to ask residents. And also my experience of the housing world is when it doesn't know what it's doing and asks residents is when it provides the best services. When we think we know what we're doing is generally when it's very dangerous for us as a housing profession, because we go ahead and do what we want with no reference to the people that are living in the houses and no relation back to what works for them. So I suspect the fact that we don't know what we're doing around circularity at the moment, because no one does, means that we have to go on a journey with our residents to come up with the answers for circularity. Probably means that we'll come up with better results than we will in 10 or 15 years' time when we think we know what we're doing around the circularity agenda. That's how I would answer it.
Maybe we can ask yours as well.
Yeah, at Zonne Kempen we will try to make a material exchange platform, and there we will try to get the tenants involved as well, because we want that the tenants can fix their own houses, small repairs of course, and we want to provide the materials so that they can be self-sustainable in maintaining their own house and get them more developed in that. We don't know what it will be because we've never done it, so we want to do it in steps. We want the material exchange platform first to be for our own handymen who are quite experienced in using second-hand materials or using parts from a garage to fix another garage. Then we want to get the other contractors involved, so the external contractors, and the last step would be to involve the tenants. We already have the tenants there because we have a community center, so the step will be fairly small, but we haven't an example, so we don't know what it will give. It's new for us as well. We have a lot of connection with the tenants. We always get their opinion when we go for renovation, but with circularity and reuse of materials, we have no experience regarding the tenants' involvement.
I think therefore, thanks, Joris. I think, Vincent, that's why that's a key question for us to be posing to the project partners too, then, because some of those discussion points are quite academic and abstract, but that's quite a specific one that they could each respond to, I think. So yeah, thank you. Thanks, Joris.
Yeah, we have circularity and we have tenant involvement, but we don't have the combination of the two yet.
Maybe, Halima, we can ask the third question to Joris before he leaves. I'm assuming he will leave in 2 minutes. I'm really curious, how will you prepare your residents for living with circularity?
We have now another European project where we have kitchen table talks, where we invite the tenants in small groups of 5 to 10 people, and where we talk about the renovation that will happen in their community. So we get the experience or the problems that they have from the users of the buildings. That's quite useful because architects don't really live in the buildings they design, and we get the information from the users, and it's quite useful to see where are the difficult points in the building. Therefore, we have already a very close connection to the tenants, and because we have in our own office building also reused materials like desks and kitchen and floors and walls and everything, it's fairly easy to sell it to the tenants because you have to convince them that it's not second-hand, that it will be bad. But if you have an example in your own office building, it's very easy to sell your idea to the tenants. Are very easy, easier.
Yeah.
There will always be resistance, but if you have a few of the tenants on board and you lead by example, it's fairly easy to sell it.
Thank you, Joris.
Thank you. Thanks, Joris. Is Isabel here from Perry Harris? I see Isabel in the.
Yeah, Julia has left.
It's just Julia left. Is
Isabel.
Julia
left, and I think it's another Isabel.
It's a different Isabel. Okay.
Isabel.
Okay. I've just seen the first word. Carl, anything else you wanted to come back on in terms of your idea of circularity with or without resident engagement? Obviously, from the discussion we've had so far, not to answer for you, but they seem quite sort of inextricably linked. But what sort of any further thoughts on circularity? Can there be circularity without resident engagement?
I suppose in a technical sense, you can have products which have a circular life cycle which have no resident engagement. I think from the standpoint of Redditch Cooperative Homes and where Redditch Cooperative Homes came from and the sort of thinking behind Redditch Cooperative Homes, then I think you can't have circularity without resident engagement, because our whole journey and process around and way that we manage the homes is around thoughts of the local economy and recirculating money in the local community. And sorry, there's something in the grass outside, and it's hot here. So apologies for the background noise there. So it's all about recirculating the local economy and those ideas that you're starting to see also with an echo in the UK and America with the Black Lives Matters movement, about how you keep the money within a community and how you try and avoid the money within a community leaking out. And those are ideas that are important, that go just beyond the circularity in terms of a technical circularity around the environment into a circularity in economics as well. And so I don't think in Redditch Cooperative Homes' case we could have had circularity without resident engagement, because I think Redditch Cooperative Homes comes from a certain political ideology, for the want of a better phrase, around recirculating resources within its local community. But that is possible to have circularity on a technical angle of any individual product without that philosophy.
That's
Yeah,
great.
I guess like I also wanted to chime in. So I'm part of a cooperative development as well, like outside of Accord as a volunteer, and I guess similar to RCH members, they have better connections in the community, are better able to link with local organisations that can create more circularity, more local responses, and work together, I guess, to create like different systems. I think.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I think that's going to be the really interesting thing, is the kind of comparing and contrasting, because you've got sort of Zonukha Kempen, which is quite small, you've got Paris Habitat, which is a huge organization, and not everyone has the opportunity of having cooperative housing models within their housing association. So how the circularity fits into existing ethos, as opposed to this is part of the ethos of circularity, which you need to then apply to your organization, I think is going to be an interesting thing to explore. Any further questions? Yeah.
I guess like also in terms of like a technical problem, for example, like product exchange and stuff like that, like in terms of like the data and the technical systems that are required to try to exchange materials, they seem to need to be quite high tech at times, basically, in order to correctly classify them and make them available to other people. Because unless you're there's a culture of basically saying this product, it's old, but it probably still has some use, and you next door or in the next street might want to use it. I think otherwise you have to work out what sort of data systems there are. And I think that's a potential where the circular economy can get out of people's hands, and people that, like the people in general, don't have control over how that happens, and that could I think that's a potential issue. And I guess that's reflected in like your literature review, which says that the social really isn't looked at. And that it's a concentration moving from product to services, and what that means in terms of where are people basically in that, and where is decision making in that, by algorithm basically, or by data structure.
I don't know if Sultan has something to comment on that, because obviously your area is kind of around looking at technology enabled circular economy, and I know Hannah had a question earlier on about sort of digital inclusion, Hannah. I was wondering if there's any final thoughts in terms of that aspect, sort of where it is quite technical and technological. Is that a barrier, or is that an enabler as your?
Yeah, it was also about the digital thinking that comes with these digital technologies. So I've just private messaged someone talking about like agile working philosophies, right. And they also seem to tie in with digital thinking. So I suppose more a digital culture rather than digital inclusion and the technologies and thinking that goes with that.
The digital culture. And Sultan, would you say that that's something you're addressing as well when you're looking at technology enabling?
Well, in my research, I'm not necessarily looking at the tenants and how they are using technology for communicating with the landlords, but rather I'm looking at technologies how housing corporations could use to manage their assets. In that sense, I think my input would be really limited on the discussion. But in the Netherlands, there's maybe it's interesting for Hannah to look at it. I'll share the link shortly. There's a fully digital housing corporation. So it's a quite experience, I think. I don't know what's happening there. I don't know if you're aware of that, Hannah.
Oh yeah, Q-Linker. Yeah. I'm in touch with.
Yeah. These are things that I know, but I am not really sure how does it impact on tenant engagement.
Okay. Yeah. It might be interesting to include some aspect of that in terms of
in our research could be
in terms of how you sort of design and how you sort of participate with the tenants in that design process when kind of the technology is such a key component of.
Well, actually, on your slides, we have a screenshot from Woonbedrijf. So during the Corona times, they used some online tools actually to participate in the design process. So somehow they are using those tools.
So it's more of an enabler then.
Maybe, yeah, Corona outbreak forced us to use more digital tools. Maybe it's another approach to.
Yeah, I'm interested in it. It's just come up a bit in my research, and it's not appeared a lot in the writing on like behavioural economics and stuff, how new technologies can fold in conceptions of the tenant. So a lot of the way I'm seeing technologies used in England folds in this notion of a needy and problematic tenant in need of intervention. So it kind of reinforces that behavioural thinking. And yet digital culture encourages people to think of these as neutral technologies that we can just apply, and they don't carry any weight. But I think they do. From what I'm finding in my research, they are not neutral. So I'm trying to explore that a little bit more. So it'll be really interesting to see how the Dutch what conceptions of the tenant and the landlord are folded into how digital technologies are thought about and applied.
Yeah, well, Halima, coming months together with Ada and Vincent, we're gonna collaborate with the with ADES. ADES is the Housing Corporations Association in the Netherlands. So we will ask what kind of technologies they're using, and for what purpose they are using those technologies. Maybe we can include a couple of questions to understand where the tenant is, and to understand how technology is kind of linking engagement or circularity, this kind of subjects. Yeah.
I think it links to issues of scale as well. We've heard a lot from the community aspect, which is fascinating, but I know in the Netherlands and the UK there's quite a few large scale landlords covering large geographies, and I think that's more that where the risk space lies in terms of problematic constructions of getting tenants involved in this. So yeah, it'd be really interesting to think about scale as well.
Definitely. Thanks, Hannah. I think we've just got a few more minutes left. David, did you have any final thoughts before we sort of thank everyone and round off, or anyone else?
I think it's been a great discussion, and I think some really useful things to feed into the research agenda for this work stream. But I just really want to thank everyone for the way it's gone. I think it's been really, really good.
Thank you. I'll reiterate that. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending this morning and for your sort of participation and interactive participation. It's been great. We found it very thought-provoking, and it's been a slightly different focus from the rest of the kind of the week's program. But there's still you can still register for this tomorrow. There's the opening official site call, and then the tour of the factory on Friday, virtual tour.
Yeah. And there's the Dragon's Den for plastics in the morning tomorrow as well.
As well. Yeah.
Yeah. But at 2 o'clock UK time in the afternoon, and then Friday morning to the factory.
Okay, great.
A brief question about that Dragon's Den poll. I think you have to be like an entrepreneur and propose something, right? Or
You don't have to be, you can be in the audience. There's like 3 people proposing, and then there's a number of dragons judging the proposals for packaging, plastic, I think plastic-free packaging and
okay.
plastics in construction.
But you can also just register as an audience member.
Yeah, that's